Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And the question you had was this: Dave, you talk about performers who are micromanagers all the time, and you say that that's terrible. What is a micromanager, and why is it terrible? Well, that's actually a very interesting question because it's a fairly recent phenomenon, at least in the field of orchestral music. So let's do a little history of micromanagement. Well, we all know what a micromanager is in general, right? Somebody who tinkers, somebody who manages or tries to have some sort of impact or effect or modification to teeny, teensy, teeny, itty bitty details. In this case, in a piece of music. It could be at your office, in a project, or something you do. It could be a letter that you've written where somebody is having a nervous breakdown over your use of the word of. You know, it's paying grotesquely ridiculous attention to non-essential details. That is how I would define micromanager. Now, what does that mean musically? It depends on the piece of music, but generally what it means musically is paying ridiculous attention to non-essential details. That is, notes that don't matter. Or if you have two-part texture, let's say you have a tune and an accompaniment, and the tune is beautiful. Let's say the tune is that wonderful slow movement from Mozart's 21st Piano Concerto, the one titled Elvira Madigan, that goes ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, and there's an accompaniment, and the accompaniment is just a simple throbbing triplet figure that goes jump 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 jump. That's the accompaniment. It's not important. So let's say you're a micromanager and you decide, oh, that poor unimportant accompaniment needs to have more attention given to it than the tune. So the tune is going ya da 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 da, and underneath all of a sudden it's going yum bum 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 bum. And instead of listening to that beautiful tune, you spend all your time paying attention to the weird shit that's going on underneath it. That's micromanaging. Now, originally, the original micromanagers were all singers. The reason they were singers is because you have a text that you can play with to fit the words, to make the music fit the words, and also because traditionally, back in the day, we're talking hundreds of years ago, there were really no conductors. There were leaders who kept the orchestra together, or conductors whose job was to follow the singer if they were just playing a keyboard like a harpsichord or a piano. I mean, imagine the simplest tune in the world. Row your boat, right? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Simple, lovely, and it's cheerful. So the overall mood you want to project is cheerful. But there are words in there that you can do things with. Imagine rowing. Oh, what a strenuous activity. Gently. Oh my, it should be soft and peaceful. Merrily, you're happy. And then you end with a dream. I mean, the interpretive possibilities are limitless if you're a micromanager. So you could do it like this. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. I mean, it would drive you crazy, right? I mean, it's just irritating as hell. Well, that's what a micromanager would do. And micromanagers who were singers were usually leader singers. They sang songs, and the songs are mostly songs. Songs are mostly simple things about love, and, that kind of stuff. But they offer opportunities to make that song seem deep, profound, and significant by making every single note meaningful. And there was a school of singing that approved of that. I mean, the great representative in the 20th century of that style of singing was Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, and she loved doing that. And people loved her for doing that because that was a style within the classical song tradition. I think it's vile, but even with that given, there were some songs written to have that kind of attention paid to them. So if it's appropriate to the repertoire, you can justify it. If it isn't, the result is grotesque. And if you want to hear that, listen to Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau sing Mahler's Des Knaben Wunderhorn songs with George Sell on Warner, where the two of them are just insufferable because these are stylized folk song settings. They depend on a level of naturalness, a naturalness that contrasts with the fabulously sophisticated accompaniments. And if you do nothing but futz around with the words, it destroys the mood that Mahler intends to create. I mean, that's what happens. But some people love that approach. So there you go. It is a matter of taste. Let's be straightforward. Now, once you get past the vocal version of micromanaging, which is really rather simple because you're dealing with a text and you can justify what you're doing based on what the words say up to a point. The problem with that kind of exaggeration is just that you're always paying attention to the moment, to the detail, and not to the big picture, not to the general flow of the melody, not to the sense of climax that the composer might have written into the music, because it's constantly being distracted and undermined. And this approach can be employed by soloists who are pianists or violinists or just about any of them. And there have always been many more there have always been many interpreters, some of whom are very interventionist and some of whom are not. But generally speaking, when you're dealing with like one line of melody, it's not such a big deal. But with a whole orchestra doing it, things get really, really crazy. Now, the reason for that is really pretty simple. An orchestra is an enormously complicated mechanism. Right? I mean, think about it. All those people doing all that stuff, everybody has their own part, or at least every group has its own part. And so they have to be played with a certain understanding of what the other section is doing. And they're all led by a conductor. And the conductor is under tremendous pressure these days because most of what he plays or she plays is something that we've all heard before a million times. In recordings, it's even worse. It's been recorded a million times. And they're under tremendous pressure to do something different, to personalize an interpretation in a very, very well-known piece of music. And that's not easy, especially when you have all those other people doing stuff. So the result of that, when you have a conductor who is micromanaging, is that they are constantly interfering with what the music wants to do and with what the musicians want to do and what the musicians know to do. Because remember, those musicians have played this same music under 10,000 other conductors, and they probably know it by heart. So while it's perfectly fine for a conductor to concern himself with certain details that will personalize an interpretation, a conductor who does that all the time creates a performance that, to my ears, and I think to a lot of yours too, winds up sounding just terminally inhibited. In other words, the music never goes anywhere. And when it's trying to go anywhere, when you reach a climax, when something big and exciting is supposed to happen, it's all tamped down and muted because they're still trying to emphasize that little accompaniment, that strange part that you're never going to hear. One of the most wonderful bits of micromanaging happens at the end of Bruckner's Fifth Symphony. At the end of Bruckner's Fifth Symphony, Bruckner's Fifth Symphony, if you know it, it ends with this huge chorale, this brass section blasting out triple forte for like the last 5 minutes. And you are not going to hear. Some of the things Bruckner wrote are not there to be heard. They're there because his obsessive logic demanded it. There is, for example, the whole orchestra is going ba bum ba da 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 da. And underneath it, the trombones and some of the other people are going bum, 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 ba-dum, bum. But they're doing it at one measure intervals. That is in a canon, like Row Your Boat. So they're going bum, bum, and the other one comes in bum, bum, da, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, like that. And that's running through the accompaniment while this huge thing is going on top. Now, you are never going to hear everything that's in the accompaniment. And you are particularly never going to hear the fact that there is a part given just to the bassoons. Because Bruckner is doing it at 1 bar intervals, it's in 4 bars, so the it's 4/4 time. So he wants that canon to be carried out at 1 measure intervals or 1 bar intervals or whatever the hell it is. So you've got one section doing here, then the other one comes in, then the other comes in, and he's sort of used up all his sections. So for that last entry, just so he could say he's covered all 4 possibilities, he gives them to 2 bassoons. It's never going to be heard. And if a micromanager allowed it to be heard, he would have to damp down the entire orchestra to the point where the entire finale would become insane. But I mean, pointless and ridiculous. So you never hear the bassoons. Nobody has yet made that bassoon part audible in performance. But at the very, very end, there is a rising flute arpeggio. When everyone's finally going da da dum ba da 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 da, the whole orchestra is dancing and bouncing around, and the flutes go do 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 do. Well, how are you going to hear 2 flutes do that? Fact is, you can if you are a micromanager at that moment. That doesn't mean you're a micromanager for the whole performance. And there are 2 conductors who let you hear it. One of them is Stanislav Skrovichevsky, and he does it by having the whole orchestra play piano just for that bar so you can hear the flutes come up. It's okay because the rest of the performance is splendid and doesn't do that. And does it also, the conductor who does it is Claudio Abbado. Now, Claudio Abbado sort of quasi lets you hear it. It's not as clear as with Skrovichevsky. I mean, if you really do it so that it's very clear, somehow it kind of works because your attention is distracted by the new thing that you're hearing. Abbado, it's sort of buried in the texture, and he's a little afraid to take it all the way down. Abbado's is also a very fine performance because he's an inveterate micromanager who does not micromanage that performance. Abbado is one of the conductors I find most problematic because of his tendency to focus on irrelevant detail and stop the music. Literally, it stops the music. And even if it's still moving along, your subjective impression is that it stopped because your hearing has stopped. You've stopped to listen to this detail, and you go, oh, okay, what was that? That's interesting. He's done this while the music has passed you by. And then you've got to catch up. There was a performance I saw live of Michael Tilson Thomas doing Mahler's First Symphony. And at the very end of Mahler's First Symphony, the whole orchestra is going crazy and everything's going nuts. And Mahler marks his parts. I mean, Mahler's parts are marked insanely because he was a conductor and he knew all the tricks. And so his parts are excessively detailed. Now, nobody can realize all of that in performance. There just isn't time. There isn't time for everyone to pay attention to everything that he's asking everybody to do. And so you generally trust the players. The conductor has to trust the players to do what Mahler is telling them to do without having to point at them and say, okay, you do this, while 10 other people are doing something else. I mean, because you're not an octopus. You don't have appendages that can point at every possible thing and dictate how it's going to be done. And so at the very end of Mahler's First Symphony, you have cymbal crashes. Some of them are double forte, fortissimo, which is basically, like as loud as possible. I mean, you could have more Fs, fortissimo, but that's really loud. And some of them are only forte. So there's a difference. But that difference is small. And in the context of the enormous brouhaha that's going on, you do not want to make it so significant that you reduce the sound of the whole brouhaha. It sounds like the brouhaha is not ha-ha. It's just brew, which is bad. So it's going crash, da, 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 crash, da, 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 da. I mean, everyone else is still playing just as loudly, but the cymbal player is doing this thing with loud and softer, louder, softer, and it draws attention away from the brilliant welter of sound that Mahler has created. The idea in differentiating the dynamics is simply that you don't cover the melody. It's not that you should play softly, notably, or you should draw the audience's attention away from what's important, which is, of course, the tune. And I saw a performance like that where he did that. It was very, very disappointing at the very end of the symphony. You can wreck an entire passage simply by that, simply by exaggerating a dynamic or by being overly fussy with accents. One of the great micromanagers in the universe was Lorin Maazel, who was always poking and prodding at music because he was an enormously gifted conductor. He actually could control what the orchestra was doing to an unbelievable degree. And he did it, not because the music wanted to, he did it because he could do it. And so all we saw was what he could do, not what the music itself wanted to do. And that, in essence, is why I think micromanaging is a terrible thing. It destroys the sense of climax, the natural sense of climax. It focuses your attention on non-essentials. It makes the music sound horribly inhibited and patchy and pokey and hesitant and twitchy and all the kinds of things that you probably shouldn't be, unless some music is like that. I mean, there are works, for example, like by Anton Webern, which every note has some sort of, expressive device or accent on it. You can be as micromanaging as you want because the pointillistic impression was part of what he wanted to do. But in music, which depends on a long singing line or in shaping of large paragraphs or strongly goal-directed approaches to form and harmony, you have to support what the piece is doing, not what you think you can do to make it sound like you rather than the composer. And that is my objection to micromanagement. I hope that this explains the situation a little bit and gives you a sense of what to listen for when you're hearing a performance. If you think the music is starting to just stop dead in its tracks, then you're probably listening to someone who's micromanaging rather excessively. It's a really bad habit, and it's a recent bad habit in terms of conductors and orchestras. And I will close with one final, ultimate, the most terrible micromanaging thing of all. That's when you have an orchestra which is so good and a conductor who's doing it that they both do it simultaneously. Because some orchestras today, they're just amazing, and the players are amazing. And they have much, much more experience of playing some of this music than the conductors do. And so if you have a conductor who's micromanaging and an orchestra who's micromanaging, and they're not micromanaging the same thing at the same time, oh my God, you have no idea what a mess is going to ensue. That happens. It happens with orchestras most recently, like the Berlin Philharmonic under Simon Rattle. It happens with some of today's best orchestras that are just amazingly talented aggregations of musicians. The Vienna Philharmonic, they have very strong corporate identities. And you have conductors who are trying just as hard to do something. And the result is just like, it's disgusting. It's like finding flies in your soup, but not one, like a whole colony of them populate. It's like fly soup. There's just things poking out and sticking out, and nothing is coherent, and for any length of time. Oh my God, what a mess! And it can happen. It can happen these days, and it happens because people are overqualified for what they're doing, in the sense that the technical aspect of what they're doing has become very, very easy in the basic repertoire, whereas intelligence, musicality, those qualities, interpretive genius, they're just as rare as they've always been. And so bored musicians will poke and prod at things just to keep it interesting for them, but not to serve the composer, not to serve the work. And that is the goal of great interpretation, of course, and that's what I listen for. And I hope this has helped you to develop a little bit of insight into what perhaps you want to focus on listening to as well. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.